The woman stepped off the train onto the dust ridge platform with nothing but a worn carpetbag in trembling hands. Her dress was gray with travel dust, her face streaked where tears had cut through the grime. She stood there as the engine hissed and pulled away, leaving her alone in the dying light of a late summer evening. She waited. No one came. Around her, families reunited. A merchant collected his shipment. A boy ran to his father. But no one approached the woman who kept glancing at faces, hope draining from her eyes with each passing minute. She was Nora Whitfield, though no one here knew her name yet. No one was supposed to. Then a man stepped forward from the edge of the platform. Tall, lean, weathered by sun and something deeper. His jaw was set tight, his eyes unreadable beneath the brim of a dusty hat. He moved with the kind of quiet that came from years of speaking only when necessary. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, neither spoke. "You're Nora," he said. Not a question. She looked up at him, confusion flickering across exhaustion. "Yes. Are you?" "I'm the man who wrote you." The lie came out flat, deliberate. "I'm Aiden Hale." She searched his face for recognition, for warmth, for anything that matched the letters she'd received. There was nothing there but stone. Still, she nodded. She had nowhere else to go. He took her bag without ceremony and turned toward a wagon hitched at the edge of town. She followed because there was no other choice. They rode in silence. The town faded behind them, swallowed by open country that stretched endlessly under a sky bleeding orange and red. The land was beautiful in a brutal way, vast, indifferent, unforgiving. Dust devils spun in the distance. The air tasted like drought. Aiden Hale had not planned this. He had not written those letters. He had not invited this woman into his life. But when he saw her standing there, abandoned and alone, something in him moved before his mind could stop it. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the memory of his own isolation reflected back at him. Maybe it was simply that he couldn't watch another person be swallowed by silence. His ranch sat miles from town, tucked against a low ridge where scrub grass clung stubbornly to life. The house was functional but joyless, weathered wood, sagging porch, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. It wasn't a home. It was a place where someone existed, nothing more. He had lived this way since his parents died. Fever took his mother first, then his father followed 6 months later, hollowed out by grief more than illness. Aiden inherited land, debts, and a silence so heavy it became a second skin. He worked sunrise to sunset, spoke to no one, refused every invitation to town dances or church socials. When his older sister Marin suggested he consider marriage, he laughed, bitter and cold. He wanted nothing to do with hope or partnership or the risk of loss that came with letting someone close. So Marin had taken matters into her own hands. She answered an advertisement in his name, invented a man who wanted companionship, and watched as letters began arriving at the ranch. Aiden found the first one by accident. He burned it without reading it. But the second one, he opened. And the third. And every one after that. He never replied, but he read them all, late at night, alone, by lamplight. Then he hid them in the bottom drawer of his desk as if touching them too long might leave a mark. Now the woman who wrote those letters sat beside him in his wagon, and the lie he'd told bound them together whether he wanted it or not. Aiden showed Nora to a small room off the kitchen, bare walls, a narrow bed, a single window that looked out toward the ridge. He set her bag down without meeting her eyes and gestured vaguely at the space. "This is yours," he said. "There's water in the basin. Supper in an hour if you want it." Then he left, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt deliberate. Nora stood in the center of the room and listened to the silence press in from all sides. This was not what the letters had promised. Those letters, someone else's letters, she was beginning to suspect, had spoken of partnership, of shared burdens, of a life built together against the harshness of the frontier. The man who'd claimed her at the station had offered none of that warmth. Only duty. Only distance. She unpacked slowly. A few dresses, a brush, a small Bible her mother had given her before the fire took everything. The farm back east was gone, burned to ash in a drought-fueled wildfire that swept through 3 counties and left her with nothing but debt she couldn't pay. She'd answered the advertisement because survival demanded it, not because she believed in romance. But she had hoped for honesty, at least. For a foundation to stand on. Instead, she'd found a man who looked at her like she was a mistake he couldn't undo. Supper was potatoes and salt pork, cooked without care and eaten without conversation. Aidan sat across from her at a scarred wooden table, chewing methodically, his gaze fixed somewhere past her shoulder. Nora tried once to speak, asked about the ranch, the land, the work that needed doing. He answered in fragments. Short. Clipped. Enough to avoid rudeness but not enough to invite connection. When the meal ended, he stood, carried his plate to the basin, and disappeared into the night to check the livestock. Nora washed the dishes alone, the only sound the scrape of tin against tin and the distant howl of wind across the plains. This became their rhythm. Days measured not in words but in tasks. Aidan rose before dawn and worked until exhaustion forced him inside. He mended fences, hauled water from the spring, tended the few cattle that hadn't been sold off to cover debts. Nora kept to the house at first, uncertain of her place, moving carefully through rooms that felt like they belonged to ghosts. She swept away the dust that returned by evening. She patched curtains that had hung threadbare for years. She discovered the stove drew poorly and cleaned the flue until it burned clean again. Aidan noticed but said nothing. He would come inside at dusk, dirt-streaked and silent, and find small changes, a table cleared of clutter, a window that let in more light, a pot of coffee waiting. He never thanked her. But he stopped flinching when she moved through the space, and stopped treating her presence like an intrusion. The land itself was harder to ignore. Drought had its claws deep in the region. The grass grew sparse and brittle. Streams that once ran year-round had dwindled to trickles. Dust storms rolled in without warning, turning midday to twilight and coating everything in a fine red grit that worked its way into every seam and crack. Neighboring ranches were beginning to fail. Families packed up and left in the night, abandoning homesteads they couldn't sustain. But Aidan's ranch had something the others didn't, a spring that fed a creek running through the lower pasture. It wasn't much, but in a dying landscape, water was everything. It kept his cattle alive. It kept him alive. And now, whether he'd planned it or not, it kept Nora alive too. She didn't ask him why he'd lied. She didn't demand explanations or apologies. She simply stayed, working beside him in silence, waiting to see if the man who'd claimed her would ever let her in. 3 weeks passed before Nora found the letters. She'd been searching the desk for a needle and thread, having seen Aidan pull sewing supplies from one of the drawers months ago, or so the dust pattern suggested. The bottom drawer stuck, warped from years of moisture and neglect. When she finally worked it open, she found them bundled together with twine, hidden beneath old account ledgers and bills marked paid. Her own handwriting stared back at her. Her own words, carefully composed in the lamplight of a boarding house room back east, when answering a stranger's advertisement had seemed like the only door left open. She lifted the bundle carefully, her hands unsteady. There were dozens of them. Every letter she'd sent over 6 months. All unopened envelopes carefully slit, the pages inside creased from being read and refolded. But there were no replies tucked between them. No drafts. No evidence that Aidan had ever written back. She sat down hard on the floor, the letters spreading across her lap. Confusion gave way to understanding, then to something sharper. He'd never responded because he'd never intended to. Someone else had written to her, someone who'd used his name without his knowledge or permission. And when she'd arrived, helpless and stranded, he'd stepped forward not out of desire but out of something else entirely. Obligation, maybe. Or pity. The realization settled cold in her chest. She was in an accident. An unwanted consequence of someone else's meddling. That evening, Aiden came in from the pasture to find Nora standing in the kitchen with the letters laid out on the table between them. He stopped in the doorway, his face unreadable, but his shoulders tensed in a way that betrayed him. "You didn't write them," she said quietly. "Not an accusation. Just a fact." He removed his hat slowly, turning it in his hands. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, "No." "Who did?" "My sister. Marin." His voice was rough, like the words cost him something. "She thought she was helping. Thought I needed." He stopped, jaw working. "I didn't know she'd done it until the letters started coming." "And you read them anyway?" His eyes flicked to hers, guarded. "Yes." But never answered. "No." Nora looked down at the letters, at the vulnerability she'd poured into them, stories of loss, of her family's farm burning, of the desperation that had driven her west. She'd been honest because she'd believed honesty was being offered in return. Instead, she'd been writing to a silence that never intended to speak back. "Why did you claim me at the station?" Her voice was steady, but something beneath it trembled. "You could have let me go. Let me find work in town or move on to somewhere else." Aiden set his hat on the hook by the door. He crossed to the window, staring out at the darkening land. "I saw you standing there," he said after a long pause. "Saw how you waited. How your face changed when you realized no one was coming." He exhaled slowly. "I know what that feels like. Being left. Being alone with it." He turned slightly, though he didn't quite look at her. "I couldn't watch it happen to someone else." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. It wasn't an apology, but it was something, a crack in the wall he'd kept between them. "So what am I to you?" she asked. "A burden you're stuck with? A mistake you're trying to fix?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I don't know yet." It wasn't the answer she wanted. But it was the truth, and in a strange way, that mattered more. Nora gathered the letters and returned them to the drawer. She didn't burn them. She didn't throw them away. They were still hers, even if they'd never reached the person she thought she was writing to. The truth changed nothing and everything. They still moved through the ranch in careful orbits, still spoke only when necessary, but the silence between them felt different now, less like avoidance, more like consideration. Nora stopped waiting for Aiden to become someone else. He stopped bracing for her to leave. She began working outside. Not because he asked, but because the land demanded it and she refused to be useless. She learned to carry water without sloshing, to scatter feed for the chickens, to recognize when the wind shifted before a dust storm hit. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her skin darkened under the relentless sun. The work was harder than anything she'd done back east, but it was honest, and it gave her a place in the rhythm of survival. Aiden watched her from a distance at first, wary of interference, but gradually he began leaving tasks within her reach. A gate that needed mending. A section of fence wire. Small tests of competence that she met without complaint. One morning, he found her kneeling in a patch of dirt near the house, planting something. He stopped, curious despite himself. "Sage and thyme," she said without looking up. "They'll grow even in drought. Useful for cooking. For medicine too, if we need it." He nodded slowly. It was practical. Smart. The kind of thinking that kept people alive out here. He started to walk away, then paused. "There's a patch of wild mint near the creek," he said. "South side, where the rocks hold shade. Might transplant if you're careful with the roots." It was the longest voluntary sentence he'd offered her in weeks. Nora looked up, shielding her eyes against the sun, and found something almost like approval in his expression before he turned back toward the barn. The drought deepened. What little grass remained turned brown and crumbled underfoot. Cattle from neighboring ranches began appearing near Aiden's creek, driven by thirst and desperation. He didn't chase them off immediately. Water was survival, and he understood that, but it meant his own herd had to share what little the land provided. Tensions across the region climbed with the temperature. In town, conversations turned sharp. Ranchers eyed each other with suspicion, measuring who still had water and who didn't. Aiden went into Dust Ridge only when necessary, and each time he returned quieter than before, his shoulders tight with unspoken worry. Nora didn't press him. She'd learned that he revealed things in his own time, if at all. Then the surveyors came. 2 men in clean suits and polished boots, accompanied by a hired hand with a wagon full of stakes and surveying equipment. They arrived mid-morning without warning, moving across Aiden's land as if they owned it. Nora saw them first from the kitchen window and called out to Aiden, who was repairing a harness in the barn. He came out fast, his face already hardening. By the time he reached them, they'd driven stakes into the ground near the spring, marking boundaries that hadn't existed the day before. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Aiden's voice was low, controlled, but edged with threat. The taller surveyor pulled folded papers from his jacket, offering them with bureaucratic indifference. Water rights assessment on behalf of Whitcomb and Avery Cattle Syndicate. These documents show legal transfer of rights dating back 30 years. The spring and lower creek fall within Syndicate territory according to corrected boundary lines. Aiden took the papers, scanning them quickly. His jaw tightened. "This land has been in my family for 2 generations. That spring is mine. Not according to territorial records." The surveyor's tone was polite but immovable. "We're just doing our job, Mr. Hale. Any disputes can be filed with the county land office." They finished staking the line and left, their wagon rattling back toward town. Aiden stood holding the papers, staring at the new markers driven into his land like insults. Nora approached slowly, reading the fury and helplessness warring in his expression. "What does this mean?" she asked quietly. He crumpled the papers in his fist. "It means they're coming for the water." The first warning came 3 nights later. Aiden found 2 fence posts cut cleanly through, the wire dragged aside to leave a gap wide enough for cattle to wander through. It wasn't wind damage or wear. Someone had done this deliberately, with tools and intent. He repaired it in the fading light, working fast, his mind turning over possibilities he didn't want to consider. The second warning was worse. One of his calves, a healthy heifer not yet a year old, lay stiff and bloated near the creek. Aiden knelt beside it, checking for injury, for signs of snakebite or disease. He found green foam crusted around its mouth. Poison. Someone had laced something, grain, maybe, or a salt lick, and left it where his cattle would find it. He buried the calf himself, digging in soil gone hard as stone, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the early hour. Nora watched from the porch, her face pale but steady. When he finished, she brought him water without a word. He drank it down, then looked at her with something raw and tired in his eyes. "They're not bluffing," he said. She knew what he meant. The Syndicate wasn't interested in legal battles or patient negotiation. They wanted the water, and they were willing to destroy everything around it until Aiden had nothing left to defend. 2 days later, the sheriff rode out from town. He was an older man, gray-haired and weathered, who'd known Aiden's father. He dismounted slowly, his expression apologetic before he even spoke. "Aiden," he said, nodding. Then, acknowledging Nora on the porch, "Ma'am." "Sheriff." Aiden crossed his arms, already braced for bad news. The sheriff removed his hat, turning it in his hands the way men did when delivering hard truths. "I'm here as a courtesy. Off the record." He glanced toward the spring, then back. "Whitcomb and Avery, they've got legal papers. Old ones. Maybe questionable, but they've got judges and lawyers who'll make them stick. They also own half the county bank and hold mortgages on most of the ranches between here and the ridge. So you're telling me the law won't help?" I'm telling you, the law is already bought. The sheriff's voice was steady but edged with regret. If you fight them in court, you'll lose. You fight them any other way, you'll end up in a cell or worse. They've got 10 men on payroll who aren't afraid of trouble, and not one of them will hesitate if it comes to that. Aiden said nothing, his jaw working as he stared past the sheriff toward his land, toward the spring that kept everything alive. The sheriff put his hat back on. I'm sorry, son. Your father was a good man. But this fight, he shook his head. It's not one you can win alone. After the sheriff left, Aiden stood in the yard for a long time, hands on his hips, staring at nothing. Nora came down from the porch slowly, stopping a few feet away. She could see the weight settling over him, the calculations running behind his eyes, how long the water would last, how much he could lose before there was nothing left worth defending. You should leave, he said finally, his voice flat. Go back to town. Find work. Get out before this gets worse. Nora's response was immediate. No. He turned to look at her, something like surprise breaking through the exhaustion. They'll come for the water. When they do, it won't be clean or legal. You don't need to be here for that. This is my home too. Her voice was steady, firm in a way that allowed no argument. I didn't come all this way just to run when things got hard. You stood up for me when no one else would. I'm standing with you now. Aiden stared at her, something shifting in his expression, disbelief giving way to recognition. For the first time since she'd arrived, he wasn't looking at a stranger or a burden. He was looking at a partner. Nora couldn't sleep that night. While Aiden sat at the kitchen table, staring at the Syndicate's papers by lamplight, she moved restlessly through the house. Her mind kept circling back to something, a detail that didn't fit, a wrongness she couldn't name. She'd read those papers twice over his shoulder. The language was dense, legal, designed to intimidate. But there was something in the land descriptions that nagged at her. She found herself in the small storage room off the back of the house, where Aiden kept old crates and boxes he'd never bothered sorting through. His parents' things, mostly. Records and personal effects he'd shoved aside after they died, unable to face them. She lifted lids carefully, sifting through account books, letters, and faded photographs. Then she found it, a leather document folder, cracked with age, containing the original deed to the property. She carried it to the kitchen. Aiden looked up as she spread the papers beside the Syndicate's claim. Look at this, she said, her finger tracing a line in the old deed. Your family's property description mentions a granite outcrop at the northwest corner, near the spring source. It's specific. Detailed. Aiden leaned closer, reading where she pointed. Now look at the Syndicate survey. She slid the other document over. They referenced the same outcrop, but their measurements put it a quarter mile south of where it actually sits. I've seen that outcrop. I walk past it when I collect mint from the creek. He read both documents again, slower this time, his expression sharpening. They moved the line. Or they're using old territorial maps that were never accurate to begin with. Nora stood, pacing. Either way, if we can prove the original boundary marker is still there, where your deed says it should be, then their claim falls apart. Aiden pushed back from the table, something like hope cutting through the fatigue. I remember that marker. My father showed it to me when I was a boy. It's carved into the base of the outcrop, half buried. I haven't thought about it in years. They went at first light. The walk took them uphill, through scrub and rock, following the creek toward its source. The land rose steadily, and with each step the spring became clearer, not a simple seep in the lowland, but water emerging from higher ground, fed by an aquifer that ran deep beneath the ridge. The granite outcrop stood gray and weathered against the morning sky, exactly where the original deed described. Aiden dropped to his knees at its base, brushing away decades of accumulated soil and debris. Nora knelt beside him, using a flat stone to scrape carefully. Her fingers found the carved letters first, initials and a date, 1847, cut deep into the rock and filled with lichen. "This is it," Aidan said quietly, tracing the marks with his thumb. "This is the original boundary. The spring source is 100 yards uphill from here, which puts it well within our land." Nora sat back on her heels, looking from the marker to the valley below where the Syndicate had staked their false line. "They're counting on no one remembering. On the records being too old or too damaged to challenge. Which means most people won't fight them." Aidan stood, offering her his hand and pulling her up beside him. "But we're not most people." She met his eyes and saw something new there, not just determination, but partnership. A shared purpose that went deeper than survival. "What do we do?" "We can't fight them alone," Aidan said, his mind already working through possibilities. "But we're not the only ranch they're threatening. Every homestead downstream depends on that creek. If Whitcomb and Avery take the water, half the county dies with it." "Then we need to tell them," Nora said. "The other ranchers. We need to show them what's happening before it's too late." Aidan nodded slowly. "They'll listen to you before they listen to me. I've kept myself apart too long. Then I'll go." Nora rode into Dust Ridge alone the next morning, sitting straight in the saddle despite her nervousness. Aidan had offered to come with her, but she'd refused. The ranchers knew him as a recluse, someone who'd turned his back on the community for years. They needed to hear this from someone who had nothing to gain but survival, someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and start over. She went door to door, ranch to ranch, speaking plainly. She showed them sketches she'd made of the boundary discrepancies, and explained how the Syndicate's survey didn't match the original territorial markers. She told them about the poisoned calf, the cut fences, the quiet intimidation designed to break Aidan's will before anyone else noticed what was happening. Some turned her away. A few accused her of stirring up trouble where none existed. But others listened, the families barely holding on, the ranchers watching their cattle thin out as water sources failed. They knew desperation when they saw it, and they recognized that if the Syndicate succeeded with Aidan's land, no one else's property rights would be safe. By late afternoon, word had spread. A meeting formed organically in front of the general store, voices rising as neighbors debated what could be done. An older rancher named Garrett spoke up, his voice carrying authority earned through decades of surviving hard seasons. "If what she says is true, we need to see that marker ourselves. We need witnesses. Legal witnesses who can testify the Syndicate's claim is fraudulent." Others murmured agreement. Plans formed quickly. They would ride out at dawn, a group large enough to be taken seriously, and confront the Syndicate's men if they showed up to press their claim. Nora rode back to the ranch as the sun dipped low, exhausted but hopeful. Aidan met her in the yard, reading the answer in her face before she spoke. "They're coming," she said, dismounting with stiff movements. 20, maybe more. Tomorrow morning." Something flickered in his expression, relief mixed with apprehension. He'd spent so long alone that the idea of others standing with him felt foreign, almost dangerous. But he nodded, accepting it. They came with the sunrise. Ranchers on horseback and in wagons, men and women who understood that this fight was bigger than one man's property. They gathered near the creek, forming a human wall between the water and the access road. Aidan stood among them, no longer isolated, his presence steadied by the weight of community he'd forgotten existed. The Syndicate's men arrived an hour later, 10 hired enforcers led by a man named Cutler, who wore his authority like a weapon. They pulled up short when they saw the crowd, their confidence wavering for the first time. Cutler dismounted slowly, his eyes scanning the gathered ranchers with cold calculation. "This is private business," Cutler said, loud enough to carry. "Between Whitcomb and Avery and Mr. Hale. The rest of you should go home before you're caught up in something that doesn't concern you." Garrett stepped forward, his weathered face hard. "It concerns all of us when you start moving boundary lines and stealing water. We've seen the original marker. We know your papers are wrong." Cutler's jaw tightened. "Those are legal documents, filed and recorded. You're interfering with legitimate business. Then let's ride up to that marker together, Aiden said, his voice steady and clear. Right now. With everyone here as witness. If your survey is accurate, it'll match. If it doesn't, you're claiming land that isn't yours. The challenge hung in the air. Cutler glanced at his men, then back at the crowd. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Violence was one thing when facing a lone rancher in the dark. It was something else entirely with 30 witnesses in daylight, including women and respected community members who would testify in any court. Before Cutler could respond, Nora pushed through the crowd, carrying the leather document folder and a surveyor's map she'd copied by hand. She held them up, her voice strong despite the fear trying to tighten her throat. These are the original territorial records. The granite outcrop mentioned in the deed is right where Mr. Hale says it is. Your surveyors either used false information or moved the line deliberately. Either way, you're committing fraud. Cutler's face darkened, but he said nothing. The silence stretched long and dangerous. His men shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward weapons, reading the tension in their leader's shoulders. Aiden saw it happening and moved deliberately, positioning himself between Nora and the hired guns. Not with aggression, with presence. Calm and unmovable. You can try to take this by force, Aiden said quietly, his eyes locked on Cutler. But you'll have to go through all of us to do it. And every person here will testify to what happened. Every newspaper in 3 counties will hear about Whitcomb and Avery using forged documents and armed men to steal land from families barely surviving a drought. The other ranchers closed ranks, forming a tighter wall. No weapons drawn, but the message was clear. They would not be moved. Cutler's hand hovered near his belt, calculating odds that no longer favored him. Too many witnesses. Too much daylight. Too much truth laid bare in front of people who mattered. His eyes flicked to the documents in Nora's hands, to the determination in the faces surrounding him, and finally back to Aiden. This isn't over, Cutler said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. Yes, it is. Garrett's voice cut through, firm and final. Take your men and go. Tell Whitcomb and Avery that if they want this land, they can argue it in front of a judge, a real one, not one they've bought. With all of us there to show the evidence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cutler jerked his reins, wheeling his horse around with more force than necessary. His men followed, their retreat carrying the bitterness of a fight lost without a shot fired. The crowd watched them disappear down the road, dust rising in their wake. When they were gone, the tension broke like a fever. Voices rose in relieved conversation, hands clasped in solidarity, neighbors acknowledging what they'd accomplished together. Aiden stood still in the center of it all, overwhelmed by the simple fact of not being alone. Garrett clapped him on the shoulder. You should have come to us sooner, Hale. Aiden nodded, unable to find words that fit the gratitude lodged in his chest. The sky had been threatening all morning, heavy clouds building over the ridge. Now, as the ranchers began dispersing back to their own land, the first drops fell. Then more. Within minutes, rain poured down in sheets, drenching the parched earth. People tilted their faces up, laughing, letting the water wash away months of dust and fear. Aiden stood in it, feeling the exhaustion of sleepless nights and constant vigilance finally catch up to him. His vision blurred at the edges. His legs wavered. He took one step toward the house and stumbled, the ground rushing up too fast. Nora caught him. Her arms wrapped around his chest, taking his weight, refusing to let him fall. I've got you, she said fiercely, holding him upright as the rain soaked them both. I've got you. He leaned against her, too tired to argue, too relieved to care. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel like a prison or a tomb. It felt like something worth protecting. Worth sharing. They made it to the porch together, moving slowly, supporting each other's weight. Inside, Nora guided him to a chair and he collapsed into it, every muscle giving way at once. She knelt beside him, checking his face with worried hands, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. "You need rest," she said. "Real rest. I need to thank you." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "For staying. For fighting. For..." He stopped, overwhelmed by everything she'd become to him without either of them planning it. She took his hand, her grip firm and certain. "This is home, Aiden. You gave that to me when I had nothing. I'm not letting anyone take it from us. Us." The words settled between them like a promise finally spoken aloud. Outside, the rain continued, soaking into land that had been dying. Inside, two people who'd arrived as strangers sat together in the quiet, no longer alone, no longer just surviving. They were home. Sometimes love isn't found, it's built, one silent day at a time. If you enjoyed Aiden and Nora's story, hit that subscribe button for more tales from the Wild West. Drop a comment and let me know what you thought. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.